Now this brings me to the reason the white people conquered the world. It was a combination of two basic things. One was an advantage in resources. The other is the fact that life reproduces itself. That second part is simpler, but a lot more profound than the first. This is another universal law that applies to everyone and to every other living thing. The white man's conquest of the world was the way an inescapable biological law that affects every species affected our species. Wherever there is food that living things can eat, and living things can get to it, living things will get to it, and they will eat it. And then they will have children, and then there will be more of them, and that will happen until all the food gets used up. Then either those living things will starve to death when they run out of food, or else they'll find something else to eat. This is why refrigerator dishes were invented, and this is why people have to weed their gardens. There is no moral law that will protect your food from mold spores if you leave it in the refrigerator uncovered. When you clear a garden plot and fertilize the soil, you create a really good place for your plants to grow. But you also create a really good place for any plants to grow. So any plants whose seeds land there are going to start growing there. Once again, there is no moral law that will protect your garden. When the white people conquered the world, what happened? Living things spread out as far as they could and used all the resources they could get to have more children. So in one sense, white people are just a bunch of glorified refrigerator mold. But in another sense, everyone's that way, so if it hadn't been the white people who conquered the world, it would have been someone else eventually. So finally, a biologist named Jared Diamond decided he was going to figure this out once and for all. His book about it is called Guns, Germs, and Steel. 11,000 years ago, people were spread out all over the world, except for some islands way out in the oceans they hadn't reached yet. Everyone had figured out how to live wherever they were, and use their universal body structure and universal brain structure to provide for their universal physical needs, and everyone thought their culture was the best. Everyone in the world got their food by hunting and gathering it wherever they could find it growing wild. Everyone had a Stone Age technological level, everyone had domesticated fire, and no one had domesticated animals. Some people were nomadic, so they moved over the course of the year to follow the growing seasons as plants bloomed and animals moved around. But some people lived in parts of the world where food grew year-round. The people who lived in those areas developed different cultures than the nomadic people. The nomadic people couldn't own any more than they could carry with them when they moved. And they had to carry everything themselves because they didn't have animals to carry it for them yet. The sedentary people were able to build permanent houses, and then they were able to build more stuff to keep in their permanent houses. So they were able to build more complicated stuff, and they were able to build stuff that was too heavy for one person to carry. And they were able to build stuff that was specialized for doing things they only needed to do a few times a year, like tools for harvesting certain plants. The stationary people could also build other buildings, like storehouses, to keep food they harvested. So they could save up some food over the course of the year to better balance their diets, or to carry them over if they had a bad season and couldn't get as much of a certain kind of food as they usually did. So 11,000 years ago, people already had different economic levels, which were creating different technological levels and cultural developments as people thought of all the ways they could use the resources they had available. About 10,500 years ago, on the plains of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the people hunted and gathered food and had children, and eventually they overhunted the local gazelle herds. Now they were in the situation of running out of food to feed everyone. So just like the mold in your refrigerator, they were going to die if they didn't get more food. But of course, these were people, so they were intelligent. So when they stopped getting enough food the old way, they started looking for new ways to get food. Soon enough, they discovered that new food plants grew out of their refuse dumps from previous years. Eventually, they figured out the trick of planting the seeds, and that began the agricultural revolution. By the way, most of Mesopotamia is in what's now Iraq, which means a lot of archaeological sites that date back to this pivotal point in world history have gotten a lot of tanks driven over them and bombs dropped on them, and a lot of archaeological museums have been looted. And of course, the invasion of Iraq was ordered by a Republican and was supported by a lot of people who always complain whenever anyone claims to have discovered any proof that white Christian Americans aren't the best people ever. This makes me wonder if perhaps a fringe benefit to invading Iraq, for some people at least, was the opportunity to help bomb world history and ethnic studies right out of existence. Anyway. A common misperception about the agricultural revolution was that it happened overnight. No, more likely it happened over the course of decades or even centuries. The first farmers of the world had never seen farming before, so they had to figure it out one step at a time. Since their goal was to produce food, people experimented with different ways of producing food, and they kept using whatever new practices they found were more effective than their old practices. They already had the tools in the storage buildings they developed for gathering wild food. They had to spend some of their time hunting and gathering to get food now, and they had to spend some time planting their seeds and tending their crops. They couldn't make the transition to tending their crops year-round until they could save up enough food to eat the whole time from the previous year. Nobody would think of spending all their time trying to grow crops that would produce food in 6 months if they had nothing to eat in the meantime. Even nomadic people took some steps toward the development of agriculture. Some nomadic people figured out the idea of sticking seeds in the ground and coming back later to see if anything had grown. Some thought of clearing land of plants that didn't produce food for them, so plants that would produce food could grow better. Some thought of fire farming, where they'd set fire to a prairie every year, so a lot of tender new plants would grow close to the ground, where they would be easy to pick, and they'd also attract a lot of animals for the people to hunt. That's what the Native Americans did on the Great Plains. Now, the sedentary people could do some things the nomadic people couldn't. Since they could save up food, not everyone had to work at food production year-round. Some people could eat the food that other people produced. Nomadic people couldn't feed as many non-food producing people because they couldn't store up food. So stationary people developed specialized labor. They could support full-time inventors, craftsmen, politicians, religious leaders, bureaucrats, and soldiers. Those people were doing things that people had been doing already. But if some people were especially good at doing some of them, they could do them full-time in exchange for the food other people produced. So political leaders and bureaucrats organized societies, religious leaders tended to people's spiritual needs, inventors invented new tools and buildings, craftsmen built new tools and buildings, and soldiers defended their territory and conquered new territory. Agriculture was also developed in China 9,500 years ago, simultaneously in Mesoamerica and the Andes about 5,500 years ago, and in the Mississippi Valley about 4,500 years ago. It might have been developed on the island of New Guinea and in 3 places in northern Africa, but for various reasons the evidence of each of those places isn't sufficient to confirm them one way or the other. In some places, agriculture led to 2 more big inventions: metalworking and writing. Metalworking let people build better tools, weapons, and armor. So that let them build more buildings, harvest more food, and conquer more of their neighbors. Nomadic people could turn soft metal, like gold and copper, into little things like jewelry and arrowheads. But they couldn't make large tools out of metal because an anvil is really heavy and you can't carry one around easily. Writing let people keep track of information more reliably and communicate it to each other in ways they couldn't before. Nomadic people could have invented writing, and some did think of ways of making marks in stone or patterns in jewelry to help them remember things. But turning your entire spoken language into a system of marks that a lot of people will learn is so complicated that no nomadic people ever did it. Only 2 groups of agricultural people ever did it, or possibly as many as 4. The idea of writing was developed independently in Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica. Systems of writing were developed in Egypt and China, but they were already connected to Mesopotamia by trade routes by then. There's no way to tell if they developed the idea of writing all on their own, or if they only developed systems of writing after they learned about the idea of writing through their trade routes. The domestication of plants helped a lot of people with the domestication of animals, but some nomadic people domesticated animals without domesticating plants. The Inuit people and others domesticated dogs just by throwing some of their meat to wolves. The friendly wolves, who would walk up to people without threatening them, were the easiest ones to feed. Then they started following the nomadic people around when they moved. Then they started living in their camps. Then they started having puppies there. And eventually, the Inuit people started hooking the nice wolves up to their sleds, and then they had their legendary dog sleds. Around that same time, the Mesopotamians domesticated cattle, goats, sheep, pigs, and the one-humped camels, and people nearby domesticated horses and donkeys. Only 14 species of large animals have been domesticated. 13 of them lived in northern Africa, Europe, or Asia, and 7 of them lived in or near Mesopotamia. The people who domesticated large animals got a lot more advantages over people who didn't have them. Large animals can be used for a lot of meat, milk, leather, and wool. They can be ridden or used to carry cargo or used to pull carts, wagons, plows, and chariots. And they turn a lot of grass into fertilizer. All of that helped the people who had large animals conquer people who didn't have them and take their land. It let them plow land that was too hard to plow by hand so they could grow more food. It let them transport food further and faster. All of that let the people who had large animals build cities because the people who could produce more food and live further away from where the food was produced. Well, wherever people live crowded together, plagues start to evolve. The faster a disease eats a person, the more powerful it can get, so the more easily it can infect the people it comes into contact with. But that's limited by the number of people the person comes into contact with. If the plague kills the person before it gets passed on, it will die out. So the more people each person comes into contact with, the more powerful the diseases get there. Also, large animals transmitted a lot of diseases to humans. Something else the Eurocentric version of history doesn't talk about much is how much the Europeans' colonization of the world was facilitated by the spread of their diseases. In some cases that was accidental, but in other cases it was intentional. Way back in the Middle Ages, when Europeans laid siege to each other's cities, some figured out the trick of spreading diseases through the city by catapulting dead animals into the city, which means biological warfare, which means weapons of mass destruction. We know for a fact that the Europeans knew how to use biological weapons when they came to the Americas because they had already been using them against each other for centuries. Ward Churchill talks about this in A Little Matter of Genocide. In Mesopotamia, the world's first farmers had no way of knowing that over-farming was possible. So they grew their crops and fed more people and built up their population size until they used up all their nutrients in their soil and lost some of their soil to erosion and salinized their soil with their irrigation, which is why the Fertile Crescent is now a desert. But by the time that happened, Mesopotamian agriculture had spread outward, which included spreading into Europe. The climate around the Mediterranean Sea was pretty close to the climate in Mesopotamia, so the Mesopotamian crops grew well there. So now the Europeans had the agriculture, the domesticated animals, the metalworking, the writing, the specialized labor, and the large population sizes, and that made them the most physically powerful group of people in the world. And that's how they eventually conquered basically everyone except the Chinese. When you leave out little details like this, it turns into another way to use the Eurocentric history to make everyone else look inferior. Mesopotamia isn't in Europe, but Judaism and then Christianity began in Mesopotamia. If farming just depended on sticking seeds in the ground, and then that let people build huge civilizations whose cultural descendants went on to conquer the world, why didn't anyone else think of that? A lot of people assume that proves there must have been some sort of superiority or divine intervention involved. No, it was just people thinking of new ideas step by step. All this useful stuff the Europeans had was stuff they could use to get what they wanted. And what they wanted was land to live on so they could raise families, so they took land from whoever they could take it from. So when you break world history down to biochemistry like this, it becomes a completely different story. Instead of a bunch of white people running around making big decisions and doing heroic things, it turns into a bunch of living things spreading out wherever they can. So that turns the history of the world into a worldwide outbreak of refrigerator mold. Learning about history is still useful because we are human beings and we do have intelligence. Just because our past worked out this way doesn't prove our present and future have to stay this way. By using a real, objective, unbiased version of history to see how people have made decisions in different situations so far, we can recognize when we're getting into the same situations now and in the future, and we can decide if we want to make the same decisions and get the same results, or if we should make different decisions and get different results. There are a lot of people in the world who don't like the way world history turned out, and who definitely don't want the future to turn out the same way, and who can already see the same things happening around them right now, which is why they're trying to stop them. The big lesson here is not manifest destiny, that the fact that white people conquered the world proved white people were supposed to conquer the world and everyone else just has to learn to accept that. No, this version of history is part of a story that's still being written by every single one of us every single day. This version of history says the world wasn't conquered by the white people. It was conquered by the people who were the most successful at directing their energy toward the achievement of their objectives. The people who did that have been mostly white so far, but that doesn't prove anything about the future. The Eurocentric version of history that mythologizes the white people's conquest of the world is leading a lot of people in America into a trap. Looking like the people who conquered the world isn't good enough. General Custer, for instance, was white, and you know what happened to him? He died. Was it really the Native Americans who won the Battle of the Little Bighorn? Or was it the people who were the most successful at directing their energy toward the achievement of their objectives? How much of the public support for the invasion of Iraq consisted of a bunch of Americans believing that the fact that America is the most powerful country ever proves we're supposed to dominate the world, and that must prove we're the good guys?